to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
Welcome. It's Friday, September 11th. This is the 41st episode of Quarantime. No one expected we'd be talking about this for so long. We're just about 6 months into all of this. And just what is this? It's not just the quarantine. It is a time when climate change is on top of us. Here in California, the skies turned Martian. We're in the middle of evidently economic upheaval, assault in social media. What an interesting time to talk about how we could use our tools towards a better outcome. And this is the theme of today's show. We're calling it World Game and Is Massive Collaboration Possible? And here's the dilemma. We live in a time of the most powerful tools there are, simulation tools, social media tools, possibly collaboration tools. And yet, are they being used properly towards that end? It's clear that social media, in many cases, is pulling us towards anti-science or towards polarization or towards conspiracy theories. And so that's a potential difference. And if you think about it, you have a whole generation coming up, Gen Z, which is at once the most utopian generation in terms of what they aspire for, and the most cynical in terms of do they have a sense of agency? And how would they understand all of this? How would they put it together? So the concept behind today's show is, what if it was possible that perhaps we use these media to imagine tomorrow, to build something better, to build it up? And how would you actually have at scale the ability to move social media from something that it pulls against science to you get rewarded, because the more good ideas, the more scientific things, the more evidence-based things, the more we would level up? And what would it mean for there to be really big global collaboration, like people working together? What tools could we use? Could we learn from companies that are doing that? Well, that's what we're going to do on today's show with people who are at the forefront of this. And we're going to put a problem set on the table that we'd like to go solve. So I'm very curious about this because what an interesting time to get started. Hello, Mickey. Here is our co-host, Mickey McManus.
Hey, Peter.
And you know, Mickey, you spend a lot
I decided
of your time
I'm just
working...
wear a shirt to match the outside atmosphere today here in San Francisco. So I'm wearing a shirt just to match the outside. So yesterday it was dark orange because we had no sun yesterday. Today it's kind of like more muddy, dirty gray. Sorry, I'm here. I'm super excited about today's episode. Yeah, I mean, I think this is going to be fun. We're going to use a different way of collaborating today. We're going to introduce everyone to something called MURAL, which is a pretty exciting thing. And we've got some teammates from MURAL. And Mohib, can you bring MURAL on the screen, my shared screen? There you go. So that's the MURAL board. And you can kind of see that we're going to be talking about this and capturing some stuff. This is, we've got a public link for this. So if you're interested in it, we can have you join the public link. Mohib, if you pass the public link on, that's up in the private chat. It would be great for anyone who feels like it to join, or this mural will last past today. So we'll be able to kind of play with it. And we also are excited to have somebody that I've interacted with a little bit, but I've gotten really excited about just getting to know, Teri Schindler, who has been working with DARPA on a new kind of a platform that that is evidence-based conversations. So it almost has micro publications that are evidence that you build into new conjectures. And so they're really interested in how do we actually look at the science of how science works. And so we thought today would be fun to look at two different ways of thinking about massive collaboration. One around kind of combating the lack of science and the polarization happening in social media, and also these amazing things that have been out there for a while, but have really gotten a boost now that we're in sort of remote work land like MURAL. And then it sounds like you've got some setup for this. Like, what could we use this to solve? And you've been talking a little bit about both the ancient kind of ideas of playing a world game and also a world fair. And how might we have a world fair that's not the generals, like General Electric, General Motors, but it's actually co-created. It's not told to us about what the future is. It's a way of co-creating. So this seems perfect time
Here's
to
how we're going to do
envision
today.
that, and you and Peter are going to set it up. Yeah.
Here comes Peter. Welcome, Peter Williams.
Hey, how are you all doing? I hope you're surviving the current enjoyable apocalypse that we seem to be in the middle of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the sun kind of came out today. Peter, you and I have been working on a project to help kind of large communities of people imagine, participate in, and execute the future. And we just to paint a little picture, we call this thing New World Fair. And the idea is, if you've been to a World's Fair, there have been World's Fairs for like over 100 years ago. They started when the industrial era started, and they showed us the future. In fact, there's one coming up in Dubai that was postponed from this year to next year. Usually when you go to a World's Fair, countries and companies show, look, here's a new technology, it uses less energy for transport, or here's our view of the future of housing. It's generally top down. Some company tells you the future. Peter and I were figuring, if one were to do something in the future now, it would have to be co-created, right? Everybody would want to participate, multiple cultural ideas, and somehow we would take advantage of the hive mind. The people around the world, students and innovators, would be collaborating and learning, and that would also perhaps reduce, polarization. And something like that might also then be a game, in the sense that you would be simulating and seeing what outcomes would work and what wouldn't. And then it would ultimately get built, in the sense that we would actually have communities that would pilot these things. There'd be spectacle when you go to it. Well, in working on this, we're starting to think, what does it mean for there to be massive simulation, massive collaboration ideas? And how do you then filter out all the problems that we have in social media? So, Peter, as we've been working on it, kind of tee up for us the kind of questions we have or the processes we're interested in. Because the way we're going to run today is Peter and I are curious, and we have some experts. So this is almost like a master class we want to go to.
So one of the things that obviously is incredibly intriguing that we want to address is, so how do you know who you're dealing with? How do you understand that the person or the group with whom you've chosen to collaborate are who they claim to be, which would be nice, have the reputation that they say that they do, and have the expertise that they're trying to convey? So that part of the problem is something that we feel is not yet well solved. We also noticed that, and I'm sure you all have as well, is the rise of simulation. So not so much simulation in a laboratory. If you look at a lot of the esports which are running today, they are some of the most sophisticated simulations that you're likely to see. And esports as an industry has grown into the many billions of dollars at a rate that I think is concerning for those more physical traditional sports. So then we also started looking at, how do you bring into the notion of engagement? This gamification, I'm sure we've all heard it. We've probably all said it in various contexts. So, oh yes, we're going to gamify this. What does that actually mean? And how do you do that in a meaningful way that engages all of the expertise around the planet, not just perhaps our rather privileged Silicon Valley or other privileged places? How do you get everybody engaged to, one, describe the sets of issues and problems that they feel are important for their city, for their community, for their environment? How do you then curate and manage that to be able to have a way of saying, there's a lot of people here are really concerned about, let's say, lead in the water in a city, or in this particular problem here, or that particular problem there. And then we've got another huge cohort of people who are producing some amazing ideas and concepts and solutions, many of whom are still looking, there's still ideas, or they've funded a startup, or they're working in a research lab, and trying to couple those two things in a way that is, how should I say, really genuine. So it's not the case where you're trying to, in Australian we would say, spruik a particular idea, but we're trying to get a best of breed model so that people who have an expertise in an area or have solution space that they think they can develop are well coupled to those that actually need and have a need for it. So back to the World Fair model, less of somebody demonstrating the new Wizzo flying car or whatever it is, although we'd love one of those, please. It's much more, here are the solution steps or the possible solutions that are driving or are trying to meet the sets of problems that we face today.
And let me add a couple of thoughts to that. One is there are collaboration systems that exist today, and they probably exist within communities. We would love to build something that draws in a broader community of people who get to watch, observe, be part of, learn from these communities, because how cool would it be from innovation communities to then spread that excitement to other people? And those very innovation communities, if linked together, build a larger community. So that's on the front end. And on the other side, as people talk about these things, if stuff actually gets funded and built, there's X prizes, communities are built, the stuff comes out the other side, how engaging is that for people to think that things happen? So that's a little bit of our vision. I want to share one more thing before we get started. These ideas of we imagine and would simulate a world and would see what might happen. In many ways, a lot of this began with the work, the system dynamics work that people like Forrester did, and the system dynamics, like the system dynamic languages. We talked about Dennis and Donella Meadows before. And Buckminster Fuller proposed a world game. He, in the 70s, proposed, what if you could simulate these things and you actually then put yourself in the framework of looking at the whole world and then try different options, as opposed to be limited to the framing of scarcity economics. He was onto this even then. And he's an inspiration for us. So what I'd like to do is, Mickey knows, we always invite a dead guest onto the show. We always invite a dead guest on the show because looking to the past is useful. So I would just like to bring up a clip of Buckminster Fuller suggesting this from the 70s, and that will inspire us as we then turn to our friends from MURAL who are taking us into this century. So let's listen to Bucky.
The world isn't working for everybody. Why isn't it?
Because they're trying to solve all the world problems with politics. And politics is based on very good policy. How do you cope with the fundamental inadequacy of life support on our planet? And all the great model of all economics is nowhere nearly enough to go around. This is completely ignorant of what you can do with modern technology. But we have the option now to make it, to take care of all humanity, the highest standard anybody's ever known. The whole game is being able to see our whole Earth at once. It's a beautiful map without any distortion, a relative shape and size of parts. As a basic background, there's one world island and one world ocean. And on that, we're then able to show where all the different resources are. We have to show where all the people are. We have to show what all the possible artifacts are that might be developed.
At a recent World Game session at U.S. International University in San Diego, one of the World Game players knew well how small and fragile the world can look. Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut from the first moon landing. We have the technology available to give everyone on Earth the highest standard of living in history, or we can destroy ourselves. At the end of the session, thousands of red chips are scattered over the map. One chip for each nuclear bomb in the world today. Buckminster Fuller has proved his point.
Peter, you're on mute.
It's always something. Yeah, I was going to invite our friends from MURAL on. Peter and I have kind of shared the challenges we have. We'd love to hear from people who work all the time on this, kind of how they approach things and what massive collaboration looks like, especially now in COVID when teams are all virtual. Nick,
Seema,
why don't you
mute? Make sure you turn yourselves off mute. Actually, let's have Seema and let's have Ward on, Mohib, and we'll bring Teri in a little bit. Seema, thank you for joining us today, and Ward, thank you for joining us. Can you give us a little sense, first of all, of your role at MURAL, and what the heck is MURAL? And then maybe we can dig in a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having us, Mickey and Peter. So my name is Seema Jain. I'm our head of solution design at MURAL. And in my role, I partner with our customers to help bring their kind of curated custom methods and practices to life in MURAL. So prior to Mural, I founded and led our design thinking practice at Blue Wolf. That was later acquired by IBM, and joined today here by Ward, my colleague in our education and nonprofit industry.
Hello. Again, thank you both for having us. So my journey with Mural is first met Mariano, our founder, 5.5 years ago, teaching my first class at the design school at Stanford. Obviously, a very much in-person pedagogy. And when I first was introduced to the technology then called Mural-y, on how we could take some of the amazing collaboration spaces from an offline scenario online, I was hooked and was able to pull that through and work with Mural in a whole host of different jobs, including at SAP and at Verizon, and joined the company in January to lead our education and nonprofit efforts. And we are very excited to help those that are wanting to make impact in another sense, not just in a commercial perspective, but socially for good. And by providing teachers and nonprofits the tools that can help empower and inspire the next generation of imagination workers is something that's kind of core to the values of Mural. So again, it's wonderful to be here and share a little bit about Mural with this audience.
As I was reading,
so for someone who doesn't know anything about Mural, go ahead here.
No, I was just going to say, as I was reading about it, it sounds like, one, I'd love you to describe the process, but I understand you bring different frameworks, different design frameworks, different disciplines. You take different approaches and mechanisms and evidently bring them to life in software that allow people to speed up innovation. So maybe you could explain to us a bit about how that design process is turned into software, and then how that then spreads to be used largely in large groups.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just by way of introduction, if you're not familiar with Mural, in its simplest form, Mural is a digital workspace for visual collaboration that helps people solve problems and understand each other and brainstorm. And as you mentioned, there's several different kind of frameworks and methodologies that enable you to do that. Ward and I are very close to the design thinking methodology as one mechanism. But we have customers who leverage Mural for agile ceremonies and rituals, the lean UX method, just like the general kind of business strategy types of frameworks. And so many of those frameworks live within the Mural construct. So as you're building your workshop and thinking about different exercises that you need to bring people through to lead towards an outcome, you can put those different building blocks together to create a comprehensive kind of workshop experience. In addition to that, we've got templates that are kind of your complete end-to-end recipe, where that brings you through a complete experience. So the website is chock full of hundreds of templates that you can step into, and again represents those methods across design, agile, lean, and kind of your general business and planning facilitations as well.
It helps if we can kind of show people what this looks like. Ward, could you show the marching band kind of example and just set it up a little bit and tell us what we're looking at?
All righty. So our company has grown a fair amount. So this exercise I'm about to show you, we probably couldn't have pulled off, Seema, back in January. But one of the ways, again, and Seema was referencing that people use Mural every day is for kind of culture and bringing communities together. And obviously that can be a work context or in projects and learning environments. And so as part of every all hands, when we get together, now somewhere over 250 employees of us, we always start off with some sort of a stoke. It's very, very common, obviously, when we do in-person workshops, you do something to kind of get people in the right mind frame. And this, obviously tends to be a type of engagement we like to do in Mural. It's a great way to kind of further, utilize and push forward our product development.
So this is sort of like an icebreaker of sorts.
This is super icebreaker.
To say, hey, this is a psychologically safe place. Yep. Okay.
So
cool. So we're looking at Mural right now, but it happens to have a red background or something. Yeah.
Right. So we started off here, Mickey, with the idea of let's do some sort of activity that, as people are kind of onboarding to their. Sorry, let me start from the beginning. It's very excited. Let's start with everybody just getting active. And this is obviously accelerated.
So these
clip.
are
It was
everybody
over about-
moving around Post-its and things, right? Yeah.
Exactly, and the goal was
Nice.
for us to spell mural as if we were a true marching band at a college football game or something along those lines. And this exercise done over a couple of minutes, people are kind of using voice a little bit, and obviously perhaps using a technology tool like Zoom or WebEx to also augment. But ultimately, we're all doing this together, and it's an exercise that is built on that kind of visual collaboration, which I think so many people are starving for as we deal with an unprecedented global pandemic, and left largely to screens and devices, and really it's prioritizing that kind of work and outcome that can be done better together. So
I'm a big fan of collaborating with different kinds of people, interdisciplinary, where the engineers were taught truth is over there, and the designers were taught truth is over there, and the business people think truth is over that way, and they all learn their own jargon and their own language and they read their own book. And one of the things we found back when I used to run Maya and the Maya Labs, and we launched Luma and the Luma Educational Institute, was this notion that that drawing is the lingua franca between disciplines. If I say draw what you mean, they'll draw a blob for a noun, they'll draw an arrow for a verb, they'll start actually getting this thing out of their head. And it's kind of like the first prototype is ink. And in whiteboards, I always used to love, and we would have these huge 360-degree whiteboards called Kivas that were used all the time and very powerful for about 30 years at Maya. One of the things I loved was somebody could walk up and just take their thumb and just kind of move erase the ink, and then just kind of draw a circle and say, no, Sarah, that's not how it is. This is the way we do things. And that's like a VP talking to the chairman or president of the company who had never actually understood they had a different model of what the heck they did as a company, right? And so I would see that happen all the time. And so I got very excited when I heard a few years ago that Luma, the Educational Institute stuff that I helped co-found, actually was a framework that was built inside of Mural very early on. And I was super excited because obviously it's about human-centered design. And so you can find it in there. We posted a public link to a mural for today's episode if you'd like to try it. Seema, do you want to pull up that, or do you want me to pull that up? I've got it up as well, just to share what the mural looks like for today, that we're just kind of trying to capture the conversation that's going on.
Absolutely. I can share my screen here. Or you got it there? Perfect. So, yeah, so what you're looking at is the Mural environment. We're a cloud-based platform. So you access this just from the web, and this is our Mural canvas. So that's what you're looking at. And I've actually been kind of taking some notes as people have been introducing themselves and sharing the challenge statements and the problems that we're facing. And then along the left there is the toolbar that you can access to bring elements over to the canvas. So you can bring things over like sticky notes, different shapes and connectors, which are really helpful for building out flow charts and process flow diagrams. And if you go down to that grid, Mickey, and click on the fourth one down, we've also got, so what you just opened was actually icons. And then here are the frameworks that I referenced earlier. So you've got actually many of Luma's frameworks available to you that you can bring over. And you've also got things like design and agile and the business frameworks that I mentioned that really do start to form those building blocks. And then we've also got images. So, we always say a picture tells 1,000 words. So you can bring over images and GIFs. And then finally, we've got our drawing capabilities as well. I know you're using your iPad today, and that's a great experience with that stylus to access some drawing capabilities as well.
Can I ask a question? In the kind of stuff that
go ahead, Peter. Yeah, because I think partly I just wanted everyone to get a sense of a little bit of the tool. When you watched, just real quick, when you watched that Ultimate Marching Band that Ward showed, think of trying to do that in an 8-foot whiteboard in a conference room with 250 people. It turns out you can't, because humans are made of atoms. And you can't stand, it's called Pauli's exclusion principle. You can't have 2 people standing in the same place at the same time, because we're excluded from having our atoms in the same place at the same time. So in a sense, this is a tool that allows you to do some things that you can't do in the physical world. And I think what I love about that is this notion that we use digital for what digital's natively good at. And we use physical and human connection for what humans are natively good at. And we look at the kind of hybrid world that we might be able to live in if we could like even reimagine what Buckminster Fuller was talking about with the world game, but with 10,000 people collaborating at the same time, with hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people as the technology gets better. How might we do that and do things that we just actually could not ever do on a whiteboard? If you try to say, please group a whole bunch of ideas that are common together, that's called affinity diagramming. You get about 30 people in a room, and pretty soon, like you gotta wait for someone to sit down before you can get up because it's too crowded. You can't like read the Post-it notes if you get over 40 years old. I have a problem with that, so I have to get closer. And this allows people to kind of zoom in, zoom out, add things. But also, it's not just during a conference call, which is unfortunately the way that the classic collaboration tools like Cisco or WebEx or all the others are, that are not persistent, because the human brain organizes information by space. We know that where something is at is what it is, and we can remember 10,000 things in physical space. So unlike seeing a PowerPoint or having this little impoverished baby whiteboard of 8 feet, you have the ability to have this kind of very large, expansive, persistent thing that might last months or years. So when new team members come in, they can wind the clock back, look at what's happening, and then be able to move forward. So I wanted to frame that for everybody, just so they have a sense of kind of some of the underlying secret. It seems like it's just a whiteboard, but actually it's really fascinating. Peter Williams, you actually look like you've got a question.
Oh, most definitely. So one of the challenges, because you've outlaid that perfectly, Mickey, is you can capture a vast amount of information. So I got two sort of questions. One is, can you capture audio and video and store that and iconize that and have access to that within the framework that you provided? And then the second thing, of course, is the navigation, because I come along later, you guys have cooked up this amazing thing, and I want to learn all about it. Can you sort of walk us around how the nav works and how you would navigate through a relatively interesting and hopefully large mural deposition?
Yeah.
I want to give that to Seema or Ward. Yeah.
I'm going to bring over an image to kind of show you a little bit about navigation here. So I'm going to share my screen just to kind of give you a sense. But actually, the navigation is really similar to a Google map. So hold on, let me see if this works. Here we go. So I've got multiple monitors here, so it's taking me a second. But are you able to see the screen here okay? There we go. So similar to a Google map. So you can,
yep,
I'm on a Mac and I'm using a mouse. So I'm just scrolling all the way out and I'm getting a complete view here of the canvas. And if I scroll all the way in, I can actually find my buddy Waldo here. I had him circled. There he is. So that kind of gives you a perspective of how you might like look at panning and zooming. And then you've also got, the mini map available to you here on the bottom right-hand corner. And what I love about this is it kind of gives you some perspective of, okay, where are my collaborators in the canvas? And as I'm facilitating these large meetings, I like to be able to track engagement and make sure folks are actually where I am. And so I can see that our visiting snail, which I think might be you, Mickey, you're zoomed out and you've got a complete view of the canvas. Yeah. But then, in that regard, there might be those instances where I want to bring you to like see Waldo. Like let's look at Waldo together. So I can actually hover over my avatar, and I've got the option here to summon. And so what that will do, Mickey, on your screen is will force you right into what I'm seeing. So you'll see exactly what I'm seeing.
Well, she just summoned me over. Yeah. Nice. So that's kind of like attention management. People can work on their own things, but you can occasionally say, hey, everybody, I need your attention. And the minute I start drawing or zooming in and out again, it breaks that attention because that's what I started doing. So you give the user a lot of control, which I think is just fascinating. So anybody can summon, but you also give facilitators some secret superpowers too. Can you talk about the secret superpowers?
Yeah, absolutely. So summon is actually one of the facilitator superpowers. So that's kind of a forceful way that I can grab your attention and bring you to where I am on the canvas. On the flip side, Mickey, you're a participant in this canvas, as is Ward, and Ward could actually hover over his avatar and request that I follow him. And you'll see like this pop-up notification just came up on my screen. So when I click on that, now my hands are off my, my mouse off my device, and as Ward's moving around and he wants to show me something, we can collaborate together that way. So in many ways, it actually kind of removes that need for screen sharing because we can just work real time live in this Canvas environment. So summon is one of the facilitator superpowers. We've also got a timer, which is a great way to kind of keep your sessions running on time. We'll often do this to some of our executives who tend to talk too long in our all hands calls. So we'll turn on the timer, it keeps them running on track. We've got a voting function. So if you're in that situation where you need to reach consensus or prioritize different ideas that are on sticky notes, we can start a voting session, and that will collect votes in an anonymous fashion, a nice kind of democratic way at reaching decisions. We've also got things like a new one actually, which is our celebrate feature. So when you have those happy moments or milestones, you can throw confetti and really celebrate. And then lastly, we've got the outline.
So I want to stop you there with the
Oh,
the outline. Okay, that like tells you what's there. I want to point out that the confetti feature may seem like kind of a silly thing, right? It may seem like, oh, whatever. But if you've ever facilitated a large-scale innovation session, you realize that you're managing everyone's energy levels for multiple days sometimes. And there has to be these moments, these kind of pinnacle moments that people get that feeling of, in gaming, they call it fiero, and they just sort of, I did it, I leveled up. And that's just a human need. And it also has to do with psychological safety. They've done some large scale studies that have actually shown us that if you tell an embarrassing story before doing an ideation session, you actually come up with 15% more ideas and 25% more divergent ideas. And it's not because someone else trusts you, it's because you actually convince your cognitive kind of overlord inside your brain that if you trusted somebody with an embarrassing story, then you also trust them to play around together. And so there are all these kind of things, and I think confetti is the first example of that. But you and I might imagine as the tool evolves, it might have some other features that really help us get the best out of our cognition as well, and sort of manage the cognitive capacity, because it can be overwhelming working together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Ward,
I wanted to ask about, at some point, I'm sorry. Yeah, go.
That's okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Seema, sorry.
Oh, I was going to add, I think the other thing
the joy of internet.
Remote meetings, right? Here we go. We're just really doing justice to the commercials we've been seeing lately. But I was going to say, I think one of the things that we recommend, in addition to, things like the reactions and confetti, is icebreakers, like Ward referenced earlier, right? And that's just another way that you can kind of break down some of those barriers in these remote situations. I recently ran a brainstorming session with a group, and before we did that, we just did a fun ice-breaking exercise, which was like, let's design a zero gravity bowling alley. And it was, opens up kind of like that big thinking. People are bringing over images, they're sketching, they're drawing. And then when you do go into that business contextual exercise on brainstorming, you're taking those principles of like this big how might we question and applying it to a real world business context example.
I have two questions. One, Peter asked a little bit about, can you put audio visual things in there? And the second question I have is, your use case, of course, is usually an enterprise. The department's trying to figure something out, or a company's trying to design a product. And when we're thinking about this, we may be bringing in people from around the world to work on a challenge. School kids in Africa, Singularity University people here, innovators somewhere, and a person in New Zealand, right? So these may be people of different cultures and backgrounds who haven't worked together. So this thing somehow has to work as a, or have you seen examples where this works educationally or an NGO where it's more ad hoc, and where the kinds of people who come may be more experts than audience. So part of what goes on in these innovation things, I suspect, is there are people who are curious to learn, and they're maybe lurking more, or they're seeing an idea and then they go off to a group and play with it. So, it's a different model when you have larger audiences involved. And then I suspect that's part of what massive looks like, people who are different places in the learning curve.
So I'll take that one. Peter, we partnered with organization called Teenagers for Change. I'll put it into the comments link for those, perhaps, or I'll put it in the private chat so Nabil can forward it around with everybody. But it was essentially a summer camp for teenagers who wanted to solve big problems together, all of whom had never met one another. So Mural became the convening mechanism by which, A, they were trained up to have some of the skills that were unlocked. Actually, our collective friend Mark Tippin's son was one of the participants, coincidentally enough. But ultimately, this was a way where kids, again, from Africa, the United States, Europe, all over the world came together to really, again, unlock their own creative capacity. And in a way that I just say, I don't know how they could have done this. And again, obviously they're before in a way that was as productive and efficient with their time, but also, again, just, resource wise, accessible, right? So we really think about inclusion. And the reason why I endorsed this tool in my class 5.5 years ago was I felt my live workshops in a class context were really, really favorable to two contexts. One is the highest paid person in the room. Everybody's running a dot voting session. Everyone's waiting to see where Seema's going to vote, and then we're going to follow accordingly because we know that Seema's got important influence on us.
And those are called hippos, right? The sort of hippo in the room. And then what else?
Extroverts dominate. I found out my second year into my MBA program that I was very loud. I wish people had told me that a little bit earlier. That'd been nice information, but I thought it was just because where I had to sit in the room. But I guess I naturally speak loudly, and so I can very easily crowd people out. And what I love about bringing Mural to my class, and Mural now bringing to tens of thousands of classes across the globe in all sorts of contexts, from kindergarten classes all the way to PhD programs, is the idea that introvert, these ideas that perhaps we as a society or specifically in a class were not properly getting a chance to surface because they just didn't feel like they had an opportunity to share. And by powers such as visual collaboration through platforms like Mural, they get a voice. So Peter, I have
a question. Tell us what those teenagers in the camp did. Like, what kind of problems did they take on? Like, what kind of groups did they break into, and what was the pacing? Like, over how long? What did they come up with?
Yeah, so it was 16 hours over 2 weeks. Their project this summer was Save the Ocean. Pretty sizable challenge, I'd say. But again, it was a very small group. Groups of 6 to 8 students focused on, and they were ranging, I think, from 13 to 19. So again, late middle school, high school, in kind of a educational context. And it was really them learning about a problem area themselves, and then beginning to use a platform like Mural to work through the process by which they were going to address some of, again, truly some of the world's biggest problems, like saving the ocean.
And the output became like a proposal, or the physics or the economics of it. What?
Exactly. It was a series of recommendations, both from a commercial and a government and environmental point of view. That again, ultimately, there were stakeholders, right? People that had raised their hand as part of the program that work in a whole host of different contexts around oceans. And so ultimately, they were being pitched and shared that information. So again, it was something where it was like, oh, this is a fun project with no result. To me, that obviously leads to frustration and disappointment, and frankly, lack of commitment. But when there was going to be obviously a final outcome, in that the audience there was very interested to hear from this group, because ultimately they are the future. There was, some really, they went well past the number of hours that I would say, that they were thinking that they had signed up for.
Hey, Ward, I've got a question. Recently Mural got a vote of confidence in terms of a bigger investment to really help scale. And I suspect it's because it's been so useful in terms of just people working remotely. Can you talk a little bit about, the big investment you just got as a company that was announced last week, and kind of what you're hoping to see happen?
Yeah, so we're very, very fortunate. And I'll just say again that in these obviously in extraordinarily complicated and challenging times, that Mural has been able to support a whole host of different organizations through visual collaboration. So yes, we did announce a large Series B funding, $118 million. With new investors coming in, such as Insight Partners, Tiger Global, Slack.
Yeah.
So again, it was a great. Obviously, a lot of people. Really, it starts with champions at some of our biggest clients and earliest clients like IBM and Autodesk. They are the ones that led us to having the good fortune to announce such news. And I think that, as we think about what's next and how do we use it, obviously there's, of course, a massively growing kind of active community of users who are in a whole host of contexts, technology, consulting, financial services. But now, we really see this as, kind of helping, again, bring Mural more impactfully to the broader kind of enterprise and education nonprofit marketplaces. So, really, it's not just about visual collaboration. From a design or from a product manager, those are some of our kind of initial personas. Now, again, Seema does some amazing work with, sales organizations across, both Mural, but also with our partners and clients, and a whole new. That was where at SAP I first saw it. SAP was struggling to apply design thinking, as we all know. Hasso Plattner is a big innovator and a big supporter of the design thinking movement. It was once the sales teams at SAP really understood that this could be a tool that helped unlock deeper, closer, more impactful conversations with customers. And again, that is, we're just scratching the surface on bringing Mural to that type of an audience. I don't know, Seema, if you have others to add, but.
A couple of very quick questions then, just to throw at you. One is the notion that I have the impression that in terms of support of process and figuring stuff out and working it out and then producing something that can have an outcome, I've got that. That sounds great. What about this notion of distributed working, where, for argument's sake, I have different groups? Do you support ontologies or taxonomies? Can they be flexible? Are they fixed? I understand, and commercially, I completely get it. The focus is definitely on the enterprise side of things, but the thing that Peter and I are working on is much more an attempt to have much more inclusive innovation, where there isn't necessarily a hierarchy nor a structure, nor is there perhaps a predetermined outcome. And we also, as we all know, think that there will be certain ideas that will bubble up and will get attraction. So I love your voting idea, being able to sort of, get some sort of conglomeration around that. But also there will be other ideas where there is going to be the person who thinks there's free energy, right? He's going to be there, and he's going to be there with his flag telling us all about it. So, to what degree do you support that range of distributed and perhaps in many cases orthogonal thinking and innovation?
That's a tough one. Seema, do you? Peter doesn't ask easy questions.
I actually think this would be nice. But Peter, I think this would be nice to actually bring Teri in, because that's one of the things that our next guest has been focusing on. And I want to thank Seema. I know you're going to have to leave pretty quickly, but thank you so much for taking some time with us. And Ward, if you can stay for a little longer, we'd love to kind of continue to just whiteboard and keep thinking about this. One aspect that relates to what Peter just said is how do you support orthogonal thinking, people from different points of view. Teri, can we have you come on next? Mohib, go ahead and bring in Teri. And thank you, Seema. Hey, Teri, thank you so much for joining. I wanted to ask if you could just say a little bit about your background, and then if you could give us a sense of what is polyplexus? Why did this thing get developed, and what is the thing that you're super excited about right now?
Hi, Mickey. Thanks, guys, for having me. I really appreciate it. And really interesting on Mural. I'll be checking that out after this. I think one of the things I was thinking about is I came to this in the world before Twitter when I was at the NBA, and I was really thinking about global community because I was in charge of the world feed. So during the finals, you would broadcast to 400 countries at the time, and you were sort of just passing through the NBC feed. And once you got that done, technically it was less interesting to be in charge of that. And so I was thinking about sort of where the fan base was, and I could come back from every break and show a shot of LeBron or Giannis, but I didn't know what people were thinking. And so sort of on the side, once I realized people couldn't see the feed I was setting out, I started soliciting people with graphics on the screen that was to say, where are you living? Who are you rooting for? What time is it? What are you doing while you're watching this? And started to get really interesting answers in global community, and really understanding how people are sort of coming together around these things, but globally, and wanting to interact. And I think at one point we even had someone propose to someone, because you're on the air every other night for 7 nights during the finals. And so, there were relationships and people came back, and it was really an interesting experiment. So with Polyplexus, what we're trying to do is we're looking at the premise is that there is nobody better than the U.S. really once research is mature of getting it to market, but to get that process to get to a worthy question, to get to a worthy proposal, to get to some really good research and some really good results and an idea, that's a little bit more ad hoc at the moment. And so could we accelerate that process in some ways by creating a system by which people could interact with that? So where we ended up was really looking at a multidisciplinary community, facilitated discussion around hard problems that might accelerate knowledge exposure and thinking. And I'll pull this up in a second. And then by way of doing that, perhaps reinventing social by really extending beyond traditional silos and focusing discussion through the lens of what we already know in pursuit of what we might discover. That's the general idea there. So you let me know, is this a good time? I can pull this up to sort of explain the process of that.
And as a framing, as I read about your
I think actually, yeah. Wait 1 sec before you pull it up, and go ahead and just load it up so you can share the screen. But Peter, you've got a question. I've got one other question too. I just want to make sure that everyone understands who funded Polyplexus and kind of what the heck that organization is, just so we can give people a little sense of context.
Of course.
People who brought us the ARPANET that became the internet. Yes.
Correct. So we were looking at this in conjunction.
And then, yeah.
And?
Yeah. Sorry, no, go ahead, and then we'll have Peter ask his question, and then I'd like you to call something up. Yeah.
This was this is a question that DARPA was really interested in, because they have their typical way of soliciting proposals through a BAA process, which is very tactical, and there's a large sheaf of paper that goes out with a lot of information on it that you then submit your proposals to. And what they were finding is they were having some trouble reaching non-traditional performers, which is what they call people who aren't in the defense contracting industry or with the big organizations, and that a lot of the ideas that they were interested in were coming from edge science, were coming from places where they didn't actually have that exposure. The companies were too small. They didn't have people who were just sort of always looking for the next BAA. Yeah, so to cast the net wider, to Peter's point, to get more inclusion into this, to get more, but in a structured way and in a gamified way, that they might provoke some unexpected collisions and some unexpected answers.
And just for everyone's context, DARPA was created right after Sputnik flew over the United States and surprised the heck out of the president and Congress and future president and just about everybody by letting every human on Earth tune a radio and hear Russia bringing America to outer space. So it was kind of a surprise. And so they created an organization. The president said, "Did you guys know about that?" to the military and to Congress, and everyone said, "No, sir, that was a complete surprise." And DARPA was created as the Department of Strategic Surprise. How do we surprise ourselves before we're surprised by somebody else? And you may know them because they created the VLSI initiative that led to the NVIDIAs and AMDs and Apples of the world being able to make their own chips. That not only Intel could do it because they put out a very simple brief call, an average organization put 1 trillion transistors on a chip, or you might know them for the ARPANET that became the internet. They've had a very good return on investment for research, but their nervousness was, as science grows and we actually democratize innovation and science around the world, because we built these platforms like the web, there's a signal to noise ratio that increases dramatically, a lot of noise. And the people who might know even that DARPA exists and know what even the letters BAA mean, and know that there might be a few $1 million or more in funding, is small compared to the crazy brains out there, because humans are just incredibly creative. And so this Polyplexus idea was, how do we actually cast a broader net, but also get the power of conversational stuff, the stuff you saw happening, during the finals and things, and then you see evolving here. How do we actually not just have it be about polarizing truthiness, but actually around science itself? So I just want to give that context for everybody who's watching. Peter, you had a question, and then I'd love Teri to pull up the polyplexes just so we get a sense of what we're looking at, what we're talking about.
As I was looking at this, it looked like there was this, you were taking some of the mechanisms of social media, like posting and voting things up and incentives, but turning them into kind of evidence and science-based stuff. And I found that fascinating, especially because over the last couple of years, we've seen social media completely pick up unscience-based stuff and reward wacko conspiracy theories. And so it seemed to have mechanisms like, instead of a long academic paper, you put down almost like long tweets or LinkedIn posts, but then the community that looked at them, it wasn't quite peer review, but it was like really smart people. And then there was something additive. Ideas were like these objects, and you added to them and you played with them and you came up with new theories and new ideas, and it was fluid. And it looked like a very positive object generative based way of playing with ideas, but with some set of incentive structures. And that struck me as a really tantalizing thing. And I'm wondering if you could just take us through that, particularly in light of our disenchantment with social media.
Yeah, of course. And also playing with this idea of the asynchronous and the synchronous conversation, right? So there's not always a game. So what are we going to be talking about when there's not a game? And I think that is what we try to do. Also trying to address the fact that there's not a scientist, you cannot read every paper that you need to read, right? And so how could we get some of your exposure to ideas you might need to solve your problem without having to read the canon and be able to understand what is actually out there. So I think if it makes sense, I'll pull this up because it's just a little easier to explain if I can show it at the same time. Let's see if we can do that.
Let's see.
Share screen. This is what I want. Let's see.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to share a screen here.
We are. We're about to share a screen.
And
if I can't do it, I'm going to put it in the...
Mohib will have to bring it on stage.
Yeah. Wait, can you put up start.polyplexus.com here? I'll just throw it in there. So for some reason that didn't work.
You talk about that, and we'll have Mohib bring that one up.
That would be great. So, and it might be that I pulled it up in a separate browser, and that may not be compatible. So it's start.polyplexus.
Somewhere, who knows? Yeah.
But so basically, the idea is, let's think Twitter, right? So if we can create what we call a micro publication, which is just a short statement that summarizes a fact that's been that's in a peer-reviewed journal, that also includes some tags so that it's searchable, and also includes the citation so that you can see it. Yeah, this is so this would be a little bit further in the process. I'll let the animation catch up with me since I'm not. Mohib, if you can hit discover, the arrow on discover, then I can start and talk about that. There we go. And so this idea is, can we create just a brief synopsis of what's actually out there? So there's actually a feed of peer-reviewed evidence statements that you can click on. You can see the citation, you can see the fields, and you can see some tags, and you can say, hey, that's pretty good. Or, hey, I'd like to submit this to an incubator, or I'd like to add this to my own personal portfolio. But it lets me look at what's actually out there. Then what I can do, this is the playfulness, that's the rigor of science. Here's the playfulness of science. I can take two disparate pieces and create what we call a conjecture. Hey, if this is true and this is true, is this potentially true? And is there something that we can do here with this? And spur some thinking around that. Then what we do is act as sort of a bit of a LinkedIn process where we would connect with research sponsors and peers in what we call incubators. And they function a little bit like AMAs. They sort of sit there. There's a question that's contextualized. There's a call for evidence. And then there's actually synchronous moments where we come together to talk about that. And then finally, we have the proposed section where we allow you to sort of take these pieces of evidence and organize it into a proposal, much more of a traditional proposal. So you could pull from multidisciplinary connected ideas and put them together to create a proposal. So that's the basic idea of what's happening here. Interestingly, Peter, what you were saying is right now, we are running, and you can go ahead and drop that now because it'll just keep running through this, but we're running 3 different incubators right now. One of them is with a resident at the Buckminster Fuller Design Studio, the Institute's design studio, looking at systems thinking. Is with DARPA, looking at AI in specific medical fields, and another one is with the National Geospatial Institute with a former program manager at DARPA who is using this to source ideas around some of the programs. So pre-research. So we're looking at this as, is this an on-ramp to you developing a real question that you want to put out for proposal? Is it actually soliciting ideas for a proposal, so you're soliciting abstracts? Or is it an off-ramp to say, hey, some interesting things came out, there might be something there, would like to organize a discussion around this?
Can you describe the?
And I guess you could imagine that over time this becomes kind of a network map of evidence and conjecture, and you start to discover people that frame problems in a very interesting way, because problem framing is one of the hardest parts of coming up with new and novel stuff. Is you can't think the old thoughts away. You've got to come up with a new way to frame it. And it feels like when we were talking with one of the gentlemen from the Geospatial Agency, he said, well, he thought of it as chapters. Yeah. The first chapter was, I write a proposal because I'm a sponsor, I'm interested in some stuff, but I write it and I frame it like, what if we invented maps and the idea of mapping today, fresh? What if humankind never had mapping and we started with all the technology we had today? How would it be different? And then he did a evidence, and a lot of people were like, oh, what about the Maoris who, go through the oceans and use pieces of wood? And what about other things? And what about new cognitive tools that help you, sense new senses? And in the act of him doing the second chapter, calling for evidence, finding things, he discovered that he reframed the question a number of times to actually find a better level of framing that would be more broad. And then he had this kind of grand event of Ask Me Anything, where you get to talk to the sponsor of a major piece of research live with Ask Me Anything, AMA, and poke around. And access was something you were saying that access turns out to be a huge deal. How do you get a chance to have access if you're a wild, crazy, interesting thinker to serious sponsors and people who are trying to solve this?
Right.
So I just love that that's the potential, and maybe a network over time of kind of, seeing when new scientific revolutions are on the horizon.
So I've got just to sort of dive in with the question here. So you mentioned at the beginning this notion of curation and facilitation. Could you walk us down that path a little bit? Because would seem that the premise here is those initial abstracts and selections of those abstracts. How's that driven? How do you do that? What is the driving set of priorities?
So it's interesting. I think right now it's very much keyed, and we're a little bit earlier in our development than MURAL, but I think it's keyed primarily from the questions that are being asked in the programming of the incubators, so to speak, right? So if we right now have 2 incubators that are looking at different sides of AI, there'll be a lot of evidence that's entered around AI. But we are talking to some people who are really interested in thinking about this as literature review, and could prompt pure literature review. So that's a little bit about the curation. I think ultimately we will generate some of this through some AI mechanisms as well. But right now, for the purpose of this, it's being driven by the conversations that are being hosted. The facilitation part is really interesting to me because it turns out not all sponsors are created equal, and some actually like to be behind the research, the research wall. Some are actually really good. And I was thinking, Mickey, when you were saying, we recently had a sponsor who came on and she was amazing. And she used all those facilitation techniques. And she would be in there saying, hey, that's really interesting. Exactly what I'm looking for. Here's, but it suggests X, Y, and Z. Could you find me evidence that would support those? And then people would sort of buzz around and collect that evidence. So I think facilitation turns out to be a really interesting thing. So some people treat it like facilitators, like we're all used to when you go into a room or and when you use a tool like Mural. But some people treat it like seminar. So every day in their incubator, they pose a different question and they ask for different research, and they're poking around and sort of trying to find the threads that they're looking for. Other people, it acts more as a Q&A, more of a traditional, and that would happen, I think, with larger funding institutions where people really just want to know, is this the answer that you want? Please let me hone in on this. So we find the conversations vary rather wildly that way, depending on the way the question is framed, and then also the facilitator ends up being a really big part of it.
So again, back to this question of
not surprisingly. Oh, go ahead.
Just for me, the essence of this, and I think what you're doing is really very awesome, is the framing of the question, as Mickey was saying, because that's going to drive everything. So as we all know from invention, one of the great challenges is you don't want to be bound by what went before, because if you are, you're going to make a slightly better mousetrap. It'd be very nice. But if you're actually going to create something completely new, it is very much finding the essence of the question and the principle underlying it that will drive that innovation. And I just wanted to, I'd just like to hear how you see that playing out with the tool set, realizing that, correct me if I'm misunderstood, that this is still pretty early days, and it really is you're figuring out stuff as you're going, and I love what you're doing.
Yeah, so we started with this idea in our early group. How do we get to a better question? So Dartmouth is famous for having these Heilmeier questions that they run all their research questions through. It's a process by which you hone your question. And we did have for a while a much more restrictive way of doing that. What we've found, that's still available if that's what you'd like to do, but we found that what works is for us to say, what are you looking to try to figure out, and give us the way you do this, and then let us make this, if you think about formats, right? The format of social and of platforms is so different from the format of a BAA or a formal RFP. Yep. And so we try to take that and at least start with that and say, for the format, let's open it this way. Let's talk about the context of COVID. Let's then frame it and get down to the actual question so that people can actually get there. One of the problems is it takes a lot. I mean, the same way it does in a room when you're having a big facilitated session where people don't want to really raise their hands, more people listen than contribute. Ward was saying he tended to dominate. We're all different that way. In this particular case, if a question is sufficiently technical, it is people stand back. They're not sure. They don't want to wing in that crazy idea because it's sort of like, okay, so how do you get it open enough and yet focused enough? That's our critical question. Right now, we're doing that with humans, creating that.
Okay, thank you.
We're hoping to get more data.
I think there's something interesting.
No, go ahead, Mickey.
Well, yeah, and I think, you said that in the long run, you're hoping to have a little bit more, since you're really actually tracking the graph. It's like a graph analysis of two pieces of micro evidence might lead to this piece of conjecture, and people might take that conjecture and lead to some other piece of evidence seeking and conjecture. You could start building kind of a graph analysis tool to be able to really understand where we have blind spots for research. Like, people are not able to find research around this. And, often, Mohib, can you bring up my whiteboard, the mural board, real quick? I was starting to kind of draw, I think that you're using the national standards for various topics that can be made. And of course, you're looking at how to evolve those, like whether it's biology or robotics. The incubators lead to more evidence being fed into the system. So you're using this almost like having an event, like a final, broadcast event, as a way of kind of building momentum in this platform, because it's very early. But we have the sort of past, and Peter said we don't want to get stuck to the past, but in some ways we need to learn from the past. We want to build on theoretical underpinnings. It took 30 years before Einstein's first theory of relativity was ever proven, and Einstein would have been laughed out of a maker shop because he didn't have cool, shiny objects for 30 years. So we do want to learn from the past, but we also want to be able to think about how do we get to that funnel of the future in new ways, and go from the impossible to the probable to the to the preferred, etc. But it's a very fuzzy space, and how do we build that? Ward, I kept thinking over and over again, what would it look like if I mashed up Mural, if there were like a plugin in Mural that like could suck in micro conjectures and micro evidence while you were in a real session that you were trying to innovate, and how could it pump it back out again, or how could it be a part of this thing, or vice versa? How might Teri start using it? I always like thinking about these two platforms that I'm fascinated by. I know they're different areas of development, but yet I feel like science matters, and safe collaborative spaces for well-facilitated, ways of expanding and contracting matter. What might you do together? And maybe that's an open question for either one of you, just as a playful kind of, we just hit a little after 5 o'clock on the West Coast.
Yeah, we got to solve that.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, how would you see it? How would you see one possible play together?
One framing that we talk about a lot is like balancing the rigor with the playfulness, and that's the innovation, that's the leap forward, that's the non-iterative step, right? So how right now the conjectures are the stand-in for playfulness, but there's an art to that, right? And then there's the rigor. This is how the evidence micropub must be crafted. This is, it has been peer reviewed, et cetera. So Ward, in some ways, if you just looked at us as sort of way more structured, and you way less structured, right? And then that's sort of the rigor and the playfulness as well. And I think, to try to figure out ways to go back and forth between those two states, which are so critical for idea generation.
Yeah, Teri, I was thinking when Mickey framed that up, I was thinking about like what series of like micro experiments could be run. Right on, as you say, like the rigor and obviously the project timelines that would be more likely in your world versus perhaps the more quick, unstructured, making sense of the chaos, as I often say. And how could you, in a more, I'd say, I guess, consumable fashion, be able to quickly confirm or reject specific aspects of a much larger initiative that you might be facilitating, and how could you do that in a way that helps make sure that you're not waiting till some sort of, again, only a point in time down the road that may seem very far away, and not provide the feedback loop as quickly as those that in many likelihoods would actually really crave and desire earlier as well as midway through a process. I don't know.
And because when we first started playtesting this, we did it with paper cards, and it was very much like Mural. We would take a card and say, well, wait, this connects to this. And we would create conjectures by physically moving these pieces on a board. And so I definitely think there's something that would be very interesting, either in the synthesis stage. I think in the synthesis, because you're trying to, once the threads are out there in an incubator, there's a lot of really good thought, but a lot of it just sort of falls away because it's not on the core idea. It'd be really interesting to collect some of that and rearrange that.
Or stress test, or maybe war game it, like, do a year and a week simulation and have like kind of chaos engineers trying to find evidence to give us an insight or something like that. I want to flip it to Peter and Peter, because you came to us at the beginning of this with a challenge, and I want to know, how would you use Mural and polyplexes to bring about what you're really working on, on World Game, World's Fair, Help Bucky, 2.0?
So one thing that I think is pertinent to both the Mural and the polyplex thing is there's a notion that we all have called purpose, and that's a central underlying principle, because the challenge, and I think you both, Ward and Teri, have just said it, is each of these elements that you bring to the party has value in and of itself, and then you create a combination of elements to address some particular problem set that you think is worthy of solution. And then the challenge is, of course, that all of that is like the noise v signal. So how do you then sort of rearrange it really quickly? So I think part of it is this notion of matching the purpose of the evidence to the purpose and therefore the very well stated question that you're trying to address. So it becomes like a purpose matching system. I think from our point of view, if I may speak for us, Pete, from a technical viewpoint, both of these tools are awesome. I really like the evidence component. And that is existing material which has been peer reviewed and is real and is not my free energy system that I'm working in the backyard on. Yes. And then the second thing is the notion of taking Mural and perhaps with a bit more of both a lo-fi and a hi-fi model. A hi-fi model has maybe more video, more audio, maybe a bit more of a temporal dimension to it, and maybe a bit more of a distributed approach. And then a lo-fi version, because most of the people that we're going to initially engage with are going to use something just like this, right? This is their engagement mechanism. And that means that much of what is going to be done is going to be natural language, and therefore you're in immediately a game of the cognitive game of natural language processing or computational linguistics and all of that fun stuff. But I think as two tools, was not expecting to, or I was, not expecting to have someone say, "Oh, here's the perfect solution for your problem, Peter." But I have to say the combination of what you guys are doing goes quite a way. Mr. Hirshberg.
Yes. So indeed, the second what you're saying, the concept of building something out of both peer-reviewed objects and mixing and matching those is attractive. And also, I guess the question I have is how that hooks up with a broader audience. Teri, you build these things for, an audience of, excuse me, the experts who are working to pick their topic. And we're talking about a broader audience, but there's something to be said then for people learn because they're watching a scientific process evolve and people are, you can even root for people. It's almost like a reality show. Your idea comes in, someone else's idea comes in, that's get voted down, this thing pops up. And so I'm interested in how, again, this combination of experts or scientists collaborating also with people who are the audience or students, but then the students start playing with these. That notion, I think, is a key thing here because that's part of the education process. And then, then the other interesting idea is in classic DARPA sense, an idea starts in the research or defense community and kind of rolls around with a small audience. And then it junks the shark and becomes general. Well, that's what the internet did, right? Until the 80s, it just stayed within that container. But there's something about your idea that could be applied more generally to social media. Entrepreneurs are running around Silicon Valley right now, especially, disappointed with the fact that the engagement mechanisms of social media, which, by the way, when we came up with them, we all thought they would be great because we would be sharing wonderful ideas and recipes and finding new ideas and stuff. But it turns out the way that works with an advertising model is deleterious, right? And then the other side product of that is facts went out the window because they weren't as exciting as that, infinite energy machine that Pete Fred says. Okay, so is there something in this that can be played with and scaled, and by adding it to a game and adding it to incentives as a meme could take on what we have now and becomes a generative thing? As I said in the opening that I posted to this show, we don't wake up right now addicted to a game where we level up by helping to save the world, but why not, right? So that, to me, I'm interested in where this leads. Particularly when crossbred with, entrepreneurs and people who know all about engagement and how to addict us, right? They're like, they're addicting us with this is interesting. So I guess the specific question is, if I had a room full of people who were former Facebook growth people and folks who understood how you build audiences with this stuff, and then I had some game design people, how would they get a hold of this, play with this, be informed by it, right? Because, here's a piece of research. How do we use this to incite something broader, including our team?
Well, part of our team included some game people that are fairly, associated with Ingress or Pokemon Go and understand the compulsion loop really well. Mm-hmm. So we had to sort of, talk to Mickey about this, think about what level of gamification is appropriate, right? When you're trying to, you're on a serious endeavor. And so we don't want to duplicate just the thumbs up. We want to say, why do you feel this way? What's happening? One place we're seeing it happen is a smaller number of people will venture an actual comment in an incubator, or a question in an incubator where they're positing something, where they're putting out a conjecture. But then a lot of people comment on that conjecture. So people jump in and say, okay, yeah, and yes, I think so, or maybe that reminds me of this. And so that ratio of what's happening there, but really trying not to go down, to use the principles of the compulsion loop and the principles of saying, what are the drivers? You know, if access is a driver, if funding is a driver, how do we think about that, and how do we make that a better user experience for everybody, and not just a superficial, like, oh, I saw this and this is interesting. Because I think that's what, that's what's happening.
Yeah, I worry a lot. I worry a lot about the difference between what, unfortunately, as Peter was saying, what social media has done and kind of picked up a lot of the dark patterns from gamification. You know, the sort of the serotonin and endorphin bursts, rather than the deep levels that all organisms play to learn in a safe environment before they go out into the real world. Puppies play with us, and so it's much better to have a Great Dane play with us when they're a puppy and learn not to bite us than when they grow up, and so play is actually a way that we build neurons. But a lot of times we saw the quick cheap VC thrill of capturing eyeballs and keeping eyeballs led to denial of cognition attacks, right? And so led to strip mining of cognitive capacity, and we have the rise of dictators and despots and things. So how do we use, though, the power of this? And you've been here from the very beginning with Apple and others in sort of looking at this insane technology, but then seeing how it gets turned into something that everybody could use, democratized. How do we give that a chance to breathe, right? Maybe something that has to do with science. Science has worked out pretty well for us as a society over a few thousand years. At least, how do we do that when we start to become kind of a societal organism? And then how do we also mitigate the new challenges I see coming in my mind, which is that when we do democratize power, does every single new startup have to have a bulletin of the atomic scientists kind of questioning policy, things like that? Because when we democratize power and everyone can be as much of a kind of moron, crazy, not wise person as Zuckerberg, because he got too much power too soon. How do we do power dynamics? How do we help a planet full of superhumans manage power dynamics? And I think science is going to help us there, although we've got a long way to go. Ward, we haven't heard from you in a little bit, and I'm actually kind of curious in this conversation. How do you see helping Peter and Peter, like the world game kind of thing, that there is the world's fair idea of co-creation? What are some ways you could imagine Mural being used for Peter's talking about a much broader audience of age ranges and audiences of thinkers that might even think there's free energy to be had, like that secret NASA skunkworks that's trying to capitalize on the energy stuck between the Vandermeer forces or something. Where do you see that going and how could you help Peter and Peter?
Yeah, it's one of the areas that I've given, I guess, a different, point of emphasis in my own thinking about what opportunities are there. Because right now, I'd say most of the collisions that happen within Mural are kind of facilitated collisions.
Yes.
And what could you do where the collisions are not facilitated by somebody, meaning somebody bringing them together? Even in the case I referenced earlier, the Teenagers for Change, there's the equivalent of counselors, facilitating that. It's not complete, but as I've thought about what would be really interesting and unique is how could there be mechanisms, because what this digital world has taught us is that groups can find like-minded and obviously in some cases very conflicting minded people and bring them together suddenly, and what could be done to bring those groups together to see what and maybe hopefully positive outcomes could be generated from groups that are not collected by some sort of formal convening fashion. And I don't think that right now, whether it be a social plug-in or other mechanisms by which people kind of come to open spaces, and I kind of think about maybe the Reddit type of world, maybe Reddit for good, where things could ultimately unlock and bring awareness to obviously things that are harmful, but also things that are great. And how do we make more of the things that are great and good and less of the things that are harmful, and having that collective energy. But like, I would say that in terms of the problems that we're focusing on solving right now, my team describes it as we're in a situation of trying to catch rain, because there's so much going on around us that we're just trying to make sure that we attend to everybody's immediate concern. So the future is very, very, unfortunately, limited in scope. But when I go for a run or I'm in the pool doing my laps, those are the things I'm thinking about. And I'm open to any of the great minds here or that want to connect afterwards on how we can push forward with it. But
well, and we didn't really touch on that too deeply, but I mean, the reason that you've gotten a vote of confidence, the reason so many organizations, and I was, in the office of the CTO at Autodesk, and so I saw the rise of Mural and oddly the rise of Luma. And then when they suddenly started showing up with Luma frameworks inside of Mural, it was crazy and beautiful, because you saw people working very differently in meetings. And these are very serious technical thinkers around physical, architecture, building cities. And right now, we haven't talked about this much, but people are starting to actually rely on Mural for business critical things, like because they cannot get their teams together. They have to do it via Mural. I heard recently of a complete offsite that usually is done with the entire office of the CTO, the entire research team. They've got groups around the world at Autodesk, and they did it for 2 days using Mural and Luma completely remotely. And one of the people who has been there since the formation, he was employee one of the CTO's office and research office. He said it might have been the best offsite they've had. Historically, they would go to, like a golf club resort somewhere and all that. And people need that physical touch and physical relationship. But it seems now you guys you said you're trying to catch rain. What is that like? Or can you give us a little sense of just in COVID times, what's it like to suddenly be kind of critical in this way for these kinds of tools for thought?
Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to have found myself in a situation where it's a bit of I call myself an entrepreneur. So whereas obviously Mural had been around for 8+ years, a dedicated focus to serving the needs of education and nonprofit organizations didn't exist. And so it was kind of like, you can use these various, tools, et cetera, but there's unfortunately not a lot of, extra support. I would say it's each day there is a message from a nonprofit, a teacher, somebody who's absolutely panicked that they have misplaced their digital whiteboard and they can't find it. And, lucky, nothing, tends to be impossible to be solved. Like we find it, but it's one of these situations where you can sense, and again, I have 3 students, learning in my household right now, the absolute fear and fright that it can exist when things that are absolutely critical don't go as planned and as designed. And I think that I was in a session earlier today where we were talking about people's sensitivity and how I think there's a greater awareness around empathy, and that conversation is bubbling up and it continues to grow. But I think there's also a sense of when things don't go right, that people are in a more panicked state than they were before. It's because, again, we've been taught and trained that these digital tools can be solving problems more quickly. And so when I think about how I can play a role in the broader Mural team can play a role in these kind of, again, very, very essential activities, and how much is kind of banking on it, because it is this connective tissue right now that's helping people address some of the things that one can't do because of COVID or other, right now, obviously, air quality. It's like you can't go, outside. You can't be inside. It's like, okay, well, where do I go? Like I need to be somewhere. Like I'm stuck. And somehow these screens that we spend so much time in front of can be this space where some of that still imagination can occur.
Peter,
Well, it's a big challenge, and I'm so glad you're there helping grow the education and NGO space, because frankly, we had an episode, the teachers episode, with 2 math teachers just about 3 episodes ago, talking about in the Chicago school system, 300,000 children. The teachers just found out 2 weeks ago whether they were going to be physical or not, and what they were going to do, and it's terror in their minds. And frankly, the whiteboard or the chalkboard is one of the most powerful tools that they have to foster Socratic thinking about tough things like math and stackable things. And so I could imagine that, I almost wish I could mash up our 2 teachers from that episode with both of you to kind of learn about this, because they were talking about the joy of math. And it was one teacher that had only been teaching for 2 years, but used to be at Cisco helping tens of thousands of girls build circuit boards. But she's only just 2 years into being a high school teacher. And this year, nobody gets to meet their kids. I mean, face to face, or do that breaking the ice of the first 2 weeks. And the other teacher, my older sister, Alana, is in charge of trying to help build math literacy with teachers about math and have them find the joy and love in a 350,000 student school system. Right? And so she's got 40 years under her belt of helping people find joy in this. And kids who are now teachers that teach the stuff that she used to teach in her class. But it's such a world where neither one of them really quite know what to do, and yet they also know deeply what works, and they're trying to find kind of a match to that, yeah, it's tough stuff. Peter, Ward, Teri, I know we're coming up on 5:30 on the West Coast.
Hey, can I ask
Peter, you're going to have to take us out of this. You're going to have to ask the last question or two and take us out, just so we can be. Yep.
Can you hear me? Good. Hey,
oh wow!
I had a question, and then I think Peter has a question. When we began this, I was interested in massive collaboration, because Peter and I are talking about a platform that will be lots of people on, the way that Facebook does. But on the other hand, massive collaboration could be lots of groups of 10 people, because you've described, I don't know, groups of 6, 10, maybe 20, 100 people. So and I'm interested in, what does it really mean to get massive global collaboration going? Because I think that was one of the problems we're looking at. Does massive collaboration mean lots of small groups, but then ideas seeping across those? Or does it mean some giant problem that lots of people are working on? How do we approach and hold that? I'd love to just kind of start ending up on that question. And what do we know about that from anybody here?
We're doing it exactly what you said, is smaller focused problems, and then the database of evidence and conjecture can inform the massive, right? That you can go ahead and dip your toes into all of that, but that the structured conversation ends up a little bit better when it's smaller and focused. I don't know how you feel, Ward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I often have a conversation with because they'll see the capacity or potential of Mural, and maybe we'll show them something fun like the marching band example, or we'll do something different. And they'll say, gosh, I could have 250 students all doing this once. I'm like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. Yeah. And when you're really trying to think about
yeah.
So I say, I look at it in a different scale, which is in the physical world, right? In front of a whiteboard, 4 to 6 people could perhaps work on an activity. Here, you probably can easily double, triple, quadruple. So you're talking about still orders of magnitude increase. Yet, we're also being reasonable to say that probably in the case, Peter, that you were asking, I would be thinking about many, many, many groups of again, a considerable size, but those that still feel like that their voice and role isn't lost, and I can just be a wallflower. Because again, ultimately, these exercises to me always kind of begin to disappoint when you run into a situation of people feeling like they can just kind of ride along.
Yep.
Well, you just reminded me, an episode or two ago, we had another dead guest, Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for economics, and the tragedy of the commons and how people have figured that out. And it's been applied now. And I think one of our future guests, David Sloan Wilson, is an evolutionary biologist who's looked at the power of small groups, because it actually fits with Darwinian evolution of prokaryotes, eukaryotes, cells, organs make systems, systems make you and I make us. It's nested containment of small groups. And I noticed that back in the day when I used to help even teach some of the Luma classes and workshops around the world, one of the real powerful ways of doing it would be 1, 2, 4 would be the first way we'd start, where people would spend time just individually, working on solving a problem as if they were the king of the world or the queen of the world. What would they do? And then 2, where it would kind of match people in pairs and they would be able to push around on their problems together. And then 4 would start to actually bring that together. And 1, 2, 4 is a very simple methodology, but it starts to say, build cellularly, start with powerful small groups, and then look for opportunities to do what we call late averaging. Early averaging leads to compromise by supersets, so you get gray sludge from a whole bunch of people and the madness of the crowds. Late averaging is actually how markets work. It's how prediction markets work. It's how other things work, where you actually allow for diversity of thought before you bring it together, so that you can actually get the richness of diversity. So, and it sounds like, Teri, you're weaving some of that right into the platform, which is very powerful. Peter, one of you, let's bring it home.
So
yes, questions, thoughts?
I think in the last 10 or so minutes, we've all been juggling in our heads the issues of organization, because ultimately us humans like to be organized, whether we like to agree with that or not. And so if you take a small group, and another business that I do, what we found is it's about 1 in 8. So for everybody saying something, there's about 8 people who are watching. So the model that we've created has the notion of the doers. Yes, okay, so that's our 8 to 6 or 8 or 10 people doing something. You've then got a bunch of followers. So, and that ratio is about 1 to 12. And these are people who are actually following, and they'll make comments and they'll contribute. And then you've got the audience. And the audience can be not infinite, but the audience is, orders of magnitude larger, and they will simply watch. They are entertained. I think the interesting thing that is necessary here, that is not well done in any of the social networks, is the mechanism for appreciation and feedback. I mean, in a TV world, it's real simple. Did everybody watch the game? Did everybody watch the episode? Yes or no? And the same thing applies here. So coupling that whole process and making like a virtuous circle, to me, would be something we should aspire to. And I think both of you have got components of that solution. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is fun. I didn't know what we'd get today. So I'm very excited.
Well, thanks, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Mickey, we've often talked about...
Thank you, Teri. Thank you, Ward. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, go, Peter. You always have to close. You have to do the final stuff. I'm trying to shut up.
Well, I have an observation that, we often talk about frontiers on this show. The American frontier, or is reurbanizing our cities, new businesses frontiers. But this is kind of what the frontier looks like of media. We're sitting here kind of at the frontier of collaborative tools, trying to figure out how we mix them and match them and use them and make sense of them. And also, we're trying to bring to this what we've learned in the last 20 years or so about these new emerging social media tools. I was 15 years ago or so, I was chairman of Technorati, the first social media search engine. In the very early days of RSS and social media, when people were posting things and we could see what people were thinking in real time, we didn't have a name for it. We're like, what is this phenomenon where it's not search, it's what's happening right now, right? Well, we now know that's Twitter and things like that. But we were trying to figure out what the medium was so we could explain it to people and what its dynamics were. And we were also very optimistic about it because it was going to democratize things, and here we are. But this strikes me as one of those product development conversations where we're all like, it's the elephant skin. We're poking and trying to learn what's this, what is curation of content that's vetted and scientific. How do these things roll out through groups? How could we take that knowledge and apply it to another medium? So that's really what we're doing here. And it's probably appropriate that we're doing it in a time of completely plastic change, when we're dealing with, when the future arrives sooner, and we're dealing with it in climate, we're dealing with it in pandemic, and we're dealing with social and economic issues. Because if we don't put these things together in some kind of game that everybody gets involved in building the future, it probably won't be great. And we need to do it in a way that is at once evidence-based and picks up on the best techniques that enterprises are using, because they're the people who are going down the curve learning about it. So This is probably a difficult way to spend a Friday afternoon because we're using our brains a lot trying to figure out something new. So I want to thank you, everybody, for that. Mickey, it's now time for you to produce the wine. I want to thank everybody here.
Oh,
Mickey,
I should. Yeah. Oh, no. I wasn't prepared.
So thank you, everybody.
I'll
Thank
wine.
you,
I'd like to
Mohib.
see the sun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mohib. Thank you, Omid, for helping in the background before the show. Thank you, Jocelyn, and our interns behind the scenes. And thank you, Teri, Ward, and Peter for joining Quarantime.
Yeah.
What time is it, Peter?
Teri, I just want to point out that Teri, Peter, it's time for me to tell Teri and Ward both that we're going to get back to you and share with you what we're up to, and we'd love you to tell us how your stuff can be integrated, because what we want to do is build a platform to take these best things and expose an awful lot of people to building the future. But Mickey, to ask your question right now, it is 5:37 Pacific Quarantine. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. We'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we try.